Good morning, everybody. My name is Heather Carter. I'm the Associate Editor of Supply Side Food and Beverage Journal. You may have known as Food and Beverage Insider, but we underwent a major rebrand this year. Same content you love, just under a different name. Welcome to today's session, Explore the Frontiers of Flavor and Texture in Baking. First, I want you all to imagine the first bite of your favorite cookie. Crispy on the outside, soft and chewy on the inside, with just the right amount of sweetness. Do you ever stop to think what makes that experience unforgettable? Today we're diving into the science and artistry behind the textures and flavors that turn a good product into a craveable one. Please welcome me in joining Liz Glenn, Senior Sensory Scientist at Land O'Lakes, who works primarily on the company's butter portfolio and has more than 2 decades of experience leading and managing sensory research projects and utilizing sensory science to help develop and improve products. And Kelly Connolly, a food scientist with more than 2 decades of experience creating food products, who also owns Little Food Lab, a custom food consulting firm in Denver. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you.
Now, we all know baked goods and confectionery items are plentiful. I'm curious to know, what trends are you both seeing in these categories?
Should I start?
Sure. Okay. So I think some of you guys have already started noticing probably the textures, different textures in baked goods. So we're starting to see incorporations of like liquids, especially in like more of the confectionery, but also in baked goods with like the gooey centers, crispy on the outside, different layers and different inclusions. So you might have something kind of crunchy with a layer of something more like a jam-like texture, and then like a crispy bottom or something like that. So that's really big and becoming increasingly popular. Something from a flavor perspective is like global flavors and fusions. We're kind of shifting around the globe. Looking at like savory flavors is something new. I know bacon has been popular for a long time here in the United States, but sweet corn is coming up. Rosemary or other herb flavors have been incorporated more popularly in baked goods. And then also we're talking about different Mediterranean, Italian, Indian, Malaysian type flavors, looking at like kulfi, kanafa in like chocolate bars. I think everybody's familiar now with like the Dubai chocolate viral on TikTok. So I don't know, Kelly, did you have things you wanted to add too?
Yes, so I've been developing products for 24 years, and in the last 3 years, every single project that I've been developing has either been gluten-free, vegan, or no added sugar or 0 sugar.
Very neat. And texture is a key component in all of these products that we see, which also varies based on a number of factors. So maybe can you touch on some of those factors that?
Yeah. Texture is the number one thing I ask a new client of what they're going for. Like, I really need to understand exactly what their target texture is at the end of shelf life. So, like if we take cookies for an example, if there could be a crispy cookie or a chewy cookie or a soft cookie, and depending on what we're trying to make, I would have to choose different ingredients and different processing.
So maybe explain a little bit more about the sensory evaluation that you use and how it goes hand in hand with product development when you're.
Well, we have,
Do you want me to take that one?
You are the sensory.
Yeah. So obviously it's going to vary a lot with the nature of the product itself and whether or not the consumer is going to be involved in the process of creating it. So if you're manufacturing like a canned dough, for example, that's going to be baked at home, it's really dependent upon what they're using to finish that product, whether it's going into a standard oven, whether it's convection, whether it's going to be the air fryers, toaster oven, etc., or the toaster itself. All of those different types of appliances can have very different effects on the finished product, and that can impact obviously also the way that the texture might come out, and it also changes the way that you might want to evaluate it. For the different types of technologies that the consumers might be using, you want to evaluate them across those so that you can check for like tolerance. I've got one of my colleagues here who works in our used to work in our culinary center here at Land O'Lakes, and I know that we spend a lot of time making sure that our products can perform across a variety of different appliances. Some other things that you might want to think about are like the variety of the different types of textures that might be observed within a baked good. So for example, let's just take a really easy version, so like brownies. Even though they're relatively homogeneous from an ingredients perspective, the dough itself, sometimes they'll have like nuts or other inclusions, but for the most part, they're pretty homogeneous. The edge of that baked good is obviously going to be very different than the center of it. And so when you're looking at from a sensory evaluation perspective, you want to make sure that you're evaluating consistently across the different variables that you might be looking at. So you always want to taste, the edge piece across all the variables as well as the center to make sure you're making a fair comparison and can adequately assess the ingredients as you're looking through and trying to decide what ingredients to move forward with from a development standpoint. We talked about, or one of the things that I also wanted to mention is the amount of time that's elapsed from the time that the product is finished. So whether it's baked and then you're evaluating it almost right out of the oven or what have you, versus 15 minutes later, a day later, et cetera, because obviously plate life comes into it as well. So you want to understand what the differences in texture might be that your consumers or your target is going to be experiencing. And you want to make sure that you're delivering on whatever that desired experience is at those different time points. So especially if it's like going to be a packaged good, that's going to be a very different experience than somebody who's going to be baking it fresh and then consuming it essentially right after baking. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And what are some of the most important things for developers to take into consideration when it comes to textures and flavors?
So when developing a product that goes into the store, you really need to consider what the shelf life is that you want to achieve, and that you need to understand how your product is going to fail shelf life. Is it going to get too hard, or is it going to dry out? So the critical thing is getting the correct packaging barrier that will avoid whatever the mode of failure is for shelf life. The second thing to really think about is if you're not using preservatives, which people that ask me to develop products never let me use preservatives. So I need to control the water activity to make sure that it's below 0.65, and I need to make sure that the moisture is around 9%. And then you basically can assume that you can maintain your shelf life to at least 6 months with the correct packaging barrier.
Yeah, there's also the difference between, the wholesomeness or the safety of the product, and then also the sensory or the desirability of that product. And I think especially when we're not using preservatives, that can be a huge barrier because it doesn't have preservatives. It's maybe if the water activity is controlled, it's not going to spoil right away, but it does. It gets hard, or maybe you'll lose some of those volatiles that are in that product that, aren't as fresh tasting as they used to be. And so you really need to understand, okay, what is the minimum hurdle that we're going to use to set what the end of shelf life looks like? And are you using your technical team from an internal company perspective? Are you doing consumer evaluations where you're actually trying to evaluate maybe a couple of different ages of different batches of products so you can understand how that performs over shelf life, and maybe even different storage temperatures, things like that, so you can see kind of tolerance testing what that's going to look like from a sensory quality standpoint over time as well.
From an ingredient standpoint, I've been seeing a lot of really cool inclusions in baked goods, like the Oreos with the Pop Rocks and all these different things. So what are some of the ingredients that you're seeing that are being used to create these unique sensory experiences?
So do you want to touch on ingredients?
So I love seeing all the cool things out there. And when I worked at Nabisco, we always tried to get them to do Pop Rocks like 20 years ago, and I'm glad to see they're finally out there. But if you take a really simple example of taking a cookie and then swapping out all of the sugar for a turbinado sugar that has a large particle size, it's really cool because the sugar doesn't dissolve. And so you get a totally different texture and a totally different flavor because you're getting like crunchy, sweet bits instead of it being throughout the cookie. So it's just one ingredient change, not doing anything else different, and you get a completely different texture.
Very cool.
Yeah, so speaking of sweeteners, they're a hot topic nowadays, especially in baked goods. So, and as consumers try to seek these better for you options that are still, indulgent. So, Kelly, if you were developing a product, say, with an alternative sweetener that was low in sugar, what would you use and why?
So I develop products in the natural organic space. So I'm limited to allulose, erythritol, and then stevia and monk fruit for high intensity sweeteners. So there's been a lot of studies that have come out recently that erythritol can be very bad for you at high doses, but everything in moderation. So it's still considered a GRAS ingredient. Um, so it really would depend on what I was making. If I was trying to make some like a crispy, low sugar, no sugar cookie, I would not be able to use allulose because allulose does not crisp. It does brown, and it is about 70% the sweetness of sucrose. So then erythritol does crisp, but it has a not great cooling sensation that that if you can kind of minimize if you have a low level of it in your product, and you can also minimize by adding a fiber that helps the cooling sensation. So the erythritol and the allulose are less sweet than sugar, but they're a similar bulking size to a sugar. So you cannot just use them alone to get the same sweetness that you would with sucrose. So then you would need to boost the sweetness with stevia and monk fruit. And I never use those alone. Like they're always in conjunction. And I have found that because stevia and monk fruit are about 300 times the sweetness of sugar, if I was trying to target something with like 18 grams of sugar, you would divide 18 by 300 and you would get 0.06. So you only need just like a touch of stevia and monk fruit. And then I always try to start my formulas with about 20% of that being monk fruit and the rest being stevia. And stevia, sorry, this is a very long answer.
No,
but,
pretty long.
but stevia is has changed over the years, and it is actually so clean. The stevia Reb M is so clean that you do not get the off metal taste that you did like 10 years ago, but you still will get it if it's too high. So if you're developing something that has no sugar and you still get like the metallic burn, just reduce your sweetener into high intensity sweeteners, like 10%, and it's probably will get rid of that aftertaste.
I was going to say, do these alternative sweeteners, do they lack some of the functionality that table sugar does?
Yes. So like I mentioned, the allulose will not crisp. So you're limited to making sort of like a soft cookie instead of like a hard cookie, if that's what you're trying to do, or whatever. Some of them are better for liquid applications, but I mostly work on baked goods. So yeah, and they don't have the same sweetness, so you can't you can't do a one-to-one replacement.
And also the off notes and side tastes associated with these sweeteners. For example, monk fruit, which was described as having this like musty, earthy taste, and depending on how highly refined it's been or where it's been sourced from. So how do you overcome these off notes or undesirable tastes?
For monk fruit, for example, if you're just using monk fruit as your sweetener, you will taste like the earthy, musty sweetness, which may work really well if it's like a cinnamon flavored something, because that inherently has the earthy mustiness. But having a combination of the stevia and the monk fruit is really the way to go to clean up the flavor, because the curve of trying to duplicate a sugar sweetness is the stevia is like really sharp and then it dies off, but whereas the monk fruit kind of helps round out the curve. So they work in conjunction very well together.
Yeah, and I think I would just add too that Kelly is exactly right, that using these different types of sweeteners in conjunction with each other can help provide a much more balanced flavor portfolio, as well as like the time intensity for the sweetness profiles. In addition to the complementariness of, so if you're working with a different sweetening system and you're getting some of those off flavors, you can reduce them, you can figure out which ones are going to be complementary, and then you can also do what Kelly was talking about, is figure out something that's going to work within the type of flavor profile that you're working with. So for example, if it has like prunes or dates or cherries or something like that that have some stronger flavors in them, that can help kind of cover or mitigate some of those off tastes. But if you're working with something that's citrusy, that's probably not going to go very well with the monk fruit, for example. They will compete with each other, and it will provide that kind of off flavor and something your consumers would probably just be like, that's something kind of strange. So you want to make sure that whatever flavor kind of category you're working in, you want to have the complementary sweeteners to go with those. So it's just something to keep in mind, the other components, the other flavor systems that are in whatever product you're working with.
And I know you touched on it briefly earlier, but when it comes to shelf life is crucial when it comes to a baked good.
Yep.
So can you pinpoint maybe the top 3 things that you focus on when you could chime in as well, Kelly, when you're tasked with creating a product with a specific shelf life that someone comes to you with?
Yeah. So basically, no product goes into the market with having validated shelf life, because to do your shelf life testing, you need the finished packaging and you need the finished formula. And in a real life shelf life, you would take it to failure. So you would have your frozen control versus your temperature abused product, and then compare it every month until you have failed shelf life in whatever way you deem failure. So what I do as a developer is I know that I have to control my water activity. I need to make sure my ingredients are clean and safe. I need to make sure that the finished moisture is low enough, and that the product is in the correct packaging to make sure that the product does not change over shelf life. And then the third thing is that a lot of people ask me to do an accelerated shelf life on a product that I have just developed. And this is not possible. I mean, the results will not be accurate because you have nothing to correlate it to. So like a cookie that's been on the market for 20 years can do an accelerated test if they do a formula change, but because they have something to correlate the real life study to. So so if I do an accelerated test on a brand new product, I may give them either a false negative or a false positive. So it's really not worth it. So lean on your product developer to make sure they know what they're doing, and get a really, really good packaging barrier.
Does an accelerated shelf life impact certain aspects of the product, the taste, the texture?
Right, so usually accelerated shelf life is super high temperatures for, I don't know, a shorter time. And then you could have volatiles that go off that wouldn't normally go off in a normal shelf life setting.
Is there anything you wanted
Yeah,
to
I
add
was
about
just
shelf
going to say, I
life?
completely agree with Kelly. She definitely leverage your product developers and make sure they know what they're doing, like Kelly does. Because sometimes that can be a big problem. But also, if you have excellent developers, just I can't speak strongly enough that I agree that assault testing or accelerated shelf life testing can be somewhat misleading. Certainly from a dairy products perspective, It can very much change the properties of the products. You can have rancidity and all sorts of other things that happen that wouldn't happen at the normal shelf life for the product. Not to say that you can't do it, but I usually caution very strongly against it unless you have very specific models that you can leverage. The other thing about shelf life testing is you want to make sure that you have some sort of internal control, whether it's products, so if it's baked goods, you might have a frozen product that you can then compare to over time so that you're making a fair comparison across time points. You can do sort of a reverse poll if you have different lots of products or ingredients, where you've got, like a 9-month sample, an 8-month sample, 7, et cetera, et cetera. So you can look at the time and how it's, how the sensory properties of the products might be shifting over time. The caveat with that is if you have a lot of lot-to-lot variation in your baked goods, if it's a very artisanal product, for example, that variation might actually kind of overshadow some of the differences that might happen due to the age of the product itself. So you have to be aware of what your kind of natural variation is in your product as you're doing the sensory evaluation. The other thing that's just a really practical thing if you're doing sensory evaluation, particularly over shelf life, is just keeping in mind the types of the properties, the sensory properties that you're trying to study, and whether or not you're overwhelming your panelists. So for example, like let's say we're talking about like a cinnamon baked good, you might only be able to taste 3, 4, maybe 5 different samples at a particular session without overwhelming your palate. And so you might want to break up those baked goods evaluation sessions over the course of a day, making sure that people have like 20, 30, 30 minutes in between tasting sessions so that you're not overwhelming yourself, so you're still sensitive to the differences that you might be experiencing. And then the other thing is, again, we were talking about this earlier, but make sure that you're making kind of fair evaluations across time, so you're comparing the same area of the baked good and even at the same time point. So if you are breaking it up from like a tasting session perspective, make sure that you're making like baking fresh batches for each session so that you're not tasting some that were baked and evaluated right away and then some that were baked and then evaluated 2 hours later, because that's not a fair comparison and you're going to pick up differences that wouldn't otherwise be there. Trying to think if there's anything else from a shelf life perspective. Yeah, I think we've covered a lot of it.
Yeah, it was like, no, these are all great insights. Yeah, I wanted to open the floor up now to any questions that any of you may have for Liz or Kelly.
Hi, great session. I'm Shantanu Yusuf with ACH Foods. I was just curious, shelf life as a product developer is, again, I agree with you guys, a huge challenge. Marketing always wants us to and sales give us an answer very quickly, like, hey, can we extend the shelf life without any data? Do you see in the space of AI, like being able to leverage that to kind of help determine shelf life? And would you trust if someone here was showcasing a AI tool that said, we can predict shelf life?
Yeah. It's a good question.
Yeah. I would try it.
So the answer that I would provide is that it really depends on the model with which you're trying to draw the insights from, right? And how educated that model is. If you have like a data lake and a history, so if you're working for with a major manufacturer that has a ton of information on particular ingredients that you might be able to leverage in your model, it might be more stable. But if you're talking about a new product or something that has very novel ingredients, I would be very hesitant to trust anything it was saying. It's the old saying, garbage in, garbage out, right? Like you have to know what information AI is providing you. So we tend to lean more towards the old-fashioned way of making sure that the information we're getting is something that we truly understand versus something that a model is just spitting out, right?
Okay. This question is for Kelly. I'm James Joseph from Jackfruit 365. So we make a product out of the jackfruit. Kelly, no sugar versus no sugar absorption. Is there an opportunity for ingredients to prevent absorption of sugar after it leaves the mouth? You get the taste, but the absorption is prevented, which means you don't get the sugar spike. Is there an opportunity for that, or is that definite no?
So you're saying that you would eat the real sugar but not absorb it.
Correct.
That sounds very interesting. I feel like I don't know. I mean, I feel like that would be like a research project that I I would be interested in
Okay.
seeing. I don't know.
Thank you.
Anyone else? All right. Well, thank you all so much for attending. Appreciate it, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.